have been arguing with each other for the last 35 years. Ed got his undergrad in physics at the University of Maryland, his PhD in physics at Wayne State University, and started his career on optical systems for monitoring Earth's climate, weather, laser comm, ocean science, worked at MITRE, and Ed has a love of the mountains. So he moved to Colorado, I believe in '84. You were there a little before me, Ed.
Right.
And worked for Martin. We worked for Martin Mull together in a vault, and on space optical systems. And then Ed went to Bow Aerospace and worked there for quite a while on space optical systems. And then Ed wanted to work for a small company, so he joined a company, SVS in Albuquerque, and worked out of his house there. And within a year, sorry for the background noise, within a year was bought by Boeing. So Ed was a large company at Boeing and became a Boeing fellow. And him and I have written 4 books together. He's chaired several conferences and written numerous papers. So with that, go ahead. I'll
Okay. And Bruce, record.
I'm just gonna watch out.
Have Bruce record, and maybe we can mute.
Mute everyone.
Everybody.
Yeah, mute everyone.
It's recording.
So,
yes, everyone please mute except Ed.
We were muted.
yes. So I'm counting on Bruce to do the muting because I'm still here in the background.
You want me to take it?
Okay, let me start. Nope.
Hi, baby. Oh, we can't listen to that right now. Come on. Mm-hmm.
Bruce, you can do a super view.
You're not muted.
I am now.
All right. Hopefully I'm the only one.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So tonight I'm going to talk about optics and art. So this has science content as well as artistic content. This is a talk I first gave back in the spring to a group of high school students who are interested in optical engineering. And I want to share with you an interesting story that's evolved over the last 20 years about theories of how the late Renaissance artists got to the point where they were producing something that looked like photographs. And the energy behind this pursuit of the truth is David Hockney, who's still alive. One of his paintings is depicted here on the first page. In the early 2000s, he produced this book called Secret Knowledge. And he's standing in front of a bunch of copies of famous art. I will explain to you why the art is presented that way. We'll get to that. And in his book, he argues that he and an optical physicist from the University of Texas argued that the Renaissance, the transition from medieval to what we recognize as Renaissance art, relied on optical engineering. It wasn't that artists got better. It's that they started using this kind of a device, a camera lucida, which is very simple. We're going to see a lot more about this. You can buy or make one of these yourself. And it's a very interesting device. The other thing that the Renaissance artists probably used is something called camera obscura. This essentially, all of you who have some interest in photography will recognize this as a box camera. It's here's the scene that's being copied. There's a pinhole, and when the sun is shining on the subject, the artist sees an inverted image of this scene and can trace it, copy it, whatever they need to do. And this works. It's difficult to deal with because you're relying on the sun. And of course, the sun is appears to be moving across the sky and means the lighting conditions are changing. But Hockneys began to master this technique because they could do extraordinary things with it, both of these techniques. So now I'm going to explain the picture that I just showed you of Hockney's. He was standing here. This is a photograph of a wall in his studio in California. It's a long wall. He and his students began being interested in depicting the evolution of European art by putting pictures drawn or art done in the northern countries at the top of the wall, and those done in the southern part of Europe at the bottom of the wall, and did it according to date. And what they noticed was that in this area, the 1300s and 1400s, the depiction of scenes was what we would now call primitive. The faces were flat, the perspective was distorted, was not what we would recognize today as realistic art. Of course, these are almost always religious depictions, and so there was some latitude given to the artist because they're drawing pictures of God and angels and so forth. But what they also noticed was right in this interval, in the early 1400s, things changed dramatically very quickly. And by the time you get to the end of the 15th century, the best of the artists were producing something that is akin to photography. And how did that rapid transition occur? Because in the thousands of years of humans depicting particularly other humans, paintings of faces and torsos, the progress had been slow and occasionally regressive. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. North to south in realism, including a proper attention to perspective, and it almost certainly, according to Hockney, and I will embrace his theory for this lecture, almost certainly comes from the use of optical techniques, not artistic techniques. Here's a depiction of this same panel of his wall. This line shows, this here is the one, a bigger picture here. But as I said, it's a big wall. So he and his students have continued to build this depiction of the evolution of European art all the way out to modern day. Now, let's talk about the techniques that Hawking thinks the Renaissance artists used. One is something called camera obscura. And in many cities around the world, or tourist cities, have a camera obscura that you can go to. I've been to this one in Edinburgh. You climb a spiral staircase to this spot here. It looks like a telescope dome, but it's not. On the top, right up there, there's a small mirror that can be controlled by the host. And that mirror directs light through a pinhole in the roof of the camera obscura. And the host can turn the mirror and tilt it. And this is what you see on this concave dish inside the darkened room. You see the city of Edinburgh, and the host can turn this thing, can point you in any direction by controlling the orientation of the mirror up on the top. The interesting thing is this kind of camera has essentially an infinite depth of field. And by that, I mean, if you take a postcard and put it into the scene and raise it up or lower it down, nothing goes out of focus. And so you have really two people doing this. Here's the guide with her microphone, and she's, and perhaps somebody else helping her by steering the mirror on the roof of the system. Same thing here, Santa Monica Pier. has one of these. It dates back. This is a picture taken, I think, in the 1920s of the same kind of configuration. Camera, it's written here, camera obscura. And the visitors just go into a darkened room and you can see the neighborhood. And essentially, you're inside of a pinhole camera. And so here's a little more on this. Pinhole camera works this way. It might have a reflective mirror that you can move out of the way to expose film. Of course, this is an antique technique for exposing film, but it's been around a long time and it works very well. And there are some industrial applications where you cannot use a camera with lenses or mirrors. If I remember, if somebody reminds me, I'll tell you about one I know of. And here's a depiction you can see probably from the 18th century of a scene with the pinhole, and the artist can stand inside and draw an upside down and backwards version of this scene. That turns out to be important, as I will discuss later. So once again, camera obscura working this way. And the patient artist can copy what is seen by looking at what's on that wall. Now, the camera lucida, I mentioned, is something you can build. I'll show you one shortly. It's a prism that allows you to see the scene, but you don't look at this object, you look at the paper and you see an image of this little statue, and you can trace it out on a piece of paper. You can use a prism, or you can use a translucent glass plane. Here's a child's version. This, if you have grandkids, you can see that this is a piece of glass here, frosted glass. And this is a picture of a dog on paper. The child is looking at that, and they end up drawing a copy of what's seen there. And here's some instruction if you want to build one yourself. Now, let's talk about the history of art, particularly in the early 14th century. And this is what I mean by non-realistic representations. In this case, this is the baby Jesus, I suppose. We would all agree that this is not what a baby looks like, and the mother's proportions, like the width of her shoulders, the size of her hand relative to the size of her head, it's just not right. And almost 100 years later, we have not much has changed. Artists were working hard to understand this, and the Greeks, and in fact the ancient Egyptians, understood perspective, but that methodology for visualization had been lost. And I'm going to show you many examples of what that meant for artistic efforts. Once again, we see this rendition here where, to my mind, there's no human who has a head that size and a leg that long. But so we can look at this. This is done probably in the 1420s or so. A cabinet maker. And it's an attractive, interesting drawing. It shows his tools and so forth. But it looks a bit odd, and there's a reason. The reason is that perspective is different for different parts of the picture. For example, this screen has an upper boundary and a lower boundary, and if you draw back to where those two intersect, this would be the perspective point. This screen has a perspective point here, but the work table, this is the edge of the work table, has a perspective point up here near the ceiling. And the beams in the ceiling have a perspective point actually not far from the screen. Actually, this artist showed some technical skill in locating everything to a common point of perspective, except the table, which possibly explains the sort of weirdness of this piece of art. And I hope you'll notice there are links here. If you get a copy of this, you can see more about this particular painting. There's a famous painting here. This is the wedding of the Arnolfini. And we have the same kind of thing going on. If you use straight lines in the drawing, you will find perspective points that are at different places. I'm going to talk about this painting quite a bit more. And this analysis that was done fairly recently, I think, the analyst is pointing out that there could be as many as 7 perspective points associated with this piece, which is famous. This is Jean Van Eyck. This is one of the most famous paintings in the world, but it has these oddities. We will explore that a bit more. So the Egyptians, this is the typical kind of thing we expect. If I said, can you identify a piece of Egyptian art? We would see this. Essentially a 2-dimensional representation with no attention to perspective, no attempt to draw or paint in 3D. But there are these examples that were lost to antiquity. These are about 5,500 years old, where the Egyptians figured it out. This looks like a human, as does this, as does this. So the Egyptians knew this, but by the Middle Ages, when European art emerged, this technique was lost. And these are from the so-called Fayum mummies. Each mummified patriarch had his drawing attached to the mummy. And so we have these extraordinary examples of the ancient artists understanding perspective, but it was lost. Now let's talk about the Arnolfini. Done in 1434. It's an extraordinary painting. I'm going to show you detail back here of how the artist represented the backs of these two in this convex mirror, which is really interesting to look at it in detail. Appears here the bride may be pregnant, and fortunately there are a lot of straight lines in this painting that we can use to explore the authenticity of the perspective used by the artist. And one thing I want to also point out is the size of the original. This is 2 feet 8 inches tall, 2 feet wide. I mean, we can estimate it here. A foot, this is a foot right here. That's since the foot, this is on the actual painting, maybe 3 inches, 3 to 4 inches. And here's a close-up of this convex mirror. And you see the backs of the wedding party. Remember, this is 3 inches wide. And then you see these fully developed items of additional representation that are only about 1/3 of an inch in diameter. And this raises the question is, how does Van Eyck get this much information jammed into these little spaces without some sort of help? And here's how to begin the process of exploring the painting. The floorboards have a point of perspective here, very consistently. All the floorboards are here. The window shades are very consistently at a perspective point here. The window sill and there's some things outside the painting I didn't include, but the parallel lines there go here, and the ceiling joists go here. Just for comparison, a modern computer scientist using computer imaging techniques has changed this, redrawn it, so everything has the same perspective point. And you can explore that here. It's interesting to look at. So the point is, Van Eyck seems to have painted this with multiple perspective points, even though the representation of the faces, let's go back, the representation of the groom's face looks more realistic than what we saw in oh, sorry. I pushed the wrong button, of course. Much more representative of humans than this. Now remember, this painting, it comes after the wedding image. So the question is, what's going on here? How did Van Eyck do this? And if he did use imaging techniques to get this kind of detail, including the distortion, you can see it here. Remember, this is 3 inches wide on the original. The distortion in the window pane and accurate representation, presumably of the back of the wedding party. How did he do that? And the Hockney's position is he used either a camera lucida or a camera obscura to create this, but he had a problem. The artist had a problem because he might have drawn the initial sketch perhaps on the first day, just looking at the floorboards. Perhaps the humans weren't even in the picture. So you do that. And a few days or weeks later, he comes back to this piece of art and takes a while to do this, but the sun position may have changed. So in order to get the light the way he wanted it, he had to move the optical equipment he was using. And so the point of perspective moved from here to here. Maybe later he drew this window business or a month. The position of the sun might have changed as a function of his work day. Once again, he moves the equipment, get this perspective, and look how consistent though he is, that all these perspective points for the ceiling equipment, the joists, all point to exactly the same point. So there's evidence here that he was using optical techniques, but he had to move it for various reasons. And we'll see more about this as we go along. These are the words I just spoke. Here's a detail. Look at this. That's a inscription. You can see how complicated in detail it is. And it spans, this is about 3 inches. That spans about 2 inches. And the chandelier, equally complicated. Here's another different places, but pointing with great precision to a small number of places. This implies that when the artist was doing what's called the cartoon, that is the first sketch, they were very careful to use the optics to find a point of perspective. And then they came back later and did it again, but the optics either moved or they moved them on purpose. So what we've found is in just 150 years or so, we go from these depictions of animals and humans to this, which is practically a photograph, including all this detail about how the light interacts with a cloth draped over the table. This is extraordinary realism. And if you take this piece of art and draw perspective lines, they all merge to a single point, with some small exceptions. So once again, I don't want to belabor this, but we have this is mid 15th century, looks much better than medieval art, about the same here, but 50 years later, we have this, which to me looks, you could reproduce this as a photograph by using modern humans and a camera. This is just as realistic as a painting can be. So along comes Hockney in the early 2000s. He was very intrigued by the artist Ingres, who did these pencil drawings. I've had the opportunity to see Ingres close up, and Hockney was taken with these. Not all of them are this good, but the ones that are good are fabulous. The way the eyes and the mouth and the conformation of the cheeks and all that structure of the human body is represented. These are small pencil sketches, not bigger than a piece of paper, but they convey emotion in a way that hand sketching would struggle to do. Now, I'll stop here and say that Hockney understands that great artists can produce great art by just looking at a scene and painting it. But there was an explosion in the late Renaissance of the number of people who could produce art of this quality. And so this, again, is some evidence that he used that something dramatic had changed. Of course, Ingres was much later, but there's some evidence that Ingres started using optical techniques to produce these pencil drawings because his earlier work is not this good. Here's Caravaggio, the late 16th century. All the perspective points here are fairly good. People have analyzed this in great detail. What's intriguing to me is the music book, where the pages, where the music follows the conformation of the pages. If you turn this around and work with it a little bit, you could sit down and play this music. So Harvey Smith is also a student of this issue of did the artists begin using optical techniques? He uses this example, famous painting of somebody, Beatrice with a weasel. These are his words. There are problems with this image that it appears to be flat and her hand is bigger than her head. This is clearly the work of somebody who could look at a human form and paint it authentically, but this part doesn't seem right. And just a few years later, so this is in the 1400s, just 100 years later, this is what we get, where there's a sense of depth, mostly involved with shadow and proper representation of the face. Now I mentioned that when you use a camera obscura, everything gets inverted. And there's an interesting sociological observation made by art historians, and that is a large number, much larger than in the general population, of subjects of Renaissance art appear to be left-handed. This is an example. This is a pope holding a magnifying glass, interesting because it was a representation of new technology coming to Italy in the form of lenses. Here's a detail of this. The Pope is holding his lens in his left hand. In the history of the Catholic Church, the number of left-handed popes has been approximately 0. Possibly related to the superstition of left-handed people having some affiliation with the devil, which is, the ancient Latin language includes the word sinistra, which means is related to our word sinister, but it also means left. And so a more than normal number of people in these art pieces are left-handed, possibly because the artist who was using an optical technique saw a right-handed person, but when they drew the representation before they started painting, they were looking at somebody as if they were left-handed because the image is inverted in the optics. So by 1623, you have this highly realistic. All the reflections look normal. I mean, so there's certainly a progression, a rapid progression. In a period of 200 years, we went from flat to truly three-dimensional. And here is a fantastic representation of this. This is the Ambassadors by Hans Holbein. Here they are. looking very realistic. And the subject for most people is this collection of navigational instruments. There's a globe and various kinds of clocks and things that all appear very realistic. We'll talk about this in a second, this blob, what that means. So this is early 16th century. And as I say, a lot of attention has been paid by historians to, and I've done amplifications here of these pieces because they talk about the exploratory techniques, the navigation techniques that were important at the time. This is the globe expanded greatly. And once again, we see this has this extraordinary realism, including the inverted writing. Would be a challenge, I think, for somebody looking at this scene, if they pose this scene, to actually draw that detail on that globe. Now, they may have had access to the globe and they could have tried, but this looks pretty authentic. Now, let's go back to this blob on the floor. The patron for this piece of art apparently had it in a hallway. So when he came out of his bedroom and turned to walk down the hall, he saw this blob from a low angle of view. And what he saw was this, a skull. And this is called a memento mori. This is a meant to remind the viewer that they are going to die and that they should live their life in an ethical way. And here's the globe again. So this is another example of where the realism in the scene is represented in a way that didn't exist 200 years before, including, once again, a music book where the pages are curved and the music curves appropriately. Now, there are a couple of issues here. Here's a book, and the perspective lines for that book, the top and bottom of the book, cross right here. This book, the perspective crosses here. And this, once again, is probably a case where the artist used a technique, which I will show you in some detail shortly. They used the technique when they were working on this part of the art, and they either accidentally or purposely moved their equipment when they got to this, to add this. This is fairly common, but it's also evident if you draw these perspective lines for this whole thing, they all are very tightly focused on that point. And we'll see that some more. Here's another clue, and it has to do with focus. If a human looks at this scene, if you pose this scene of husband and wife, you would not notice that this region of the table is out of focus. Because for you, it wouldn't be. If you turn your attention from this edge to this area, which is in shadow, or right here, you see this is in focus. Your eye and brain work together to focus this. The artist cannot perceive this defocus, and yet, when you look at this area of the table, it's out of focus. Here's a better example. Here's the edge of the table. Everything, all the threads are in focus. If you go back here, out of focus. So the human viewing this posed scene would not paint this unless they had some kind of optical equipment, because you would see every part of the field in focus, assuming you have good vision. But if you have an optical system like a camera lucida, and you're duplicating what the camera is showing you, you end up with defocus because the tool you're using has a limited range of focus. Here's an even better depiction. Here's the front edge of the table, focused, and these decorations here are out of focus. That's another clue that the fact that this is out of focus is a result of using a lens. Once again, a very nice drawing of this table, except something changed and the point of focus kept moving around. But notice at any point of focus, the lines are clustered closely, indicating that the artist was careful and used the right techniques. Now, let me introduce a guy named Tim. Tim is intrigued. I'll introduce Tim in more detail in a second. I include this panel that he was introduced to Hockney's book in maybe 2006 or 2007. Somebody gave it to him as a gift, and he was intrigued by this lack of perspective and then this wonderful artistic representation of reality. And he was determined to understand if that was true. Now, Tim is a technological entrepreneur. He's extremely wealthy. He builds equipment used by podcasters and people who do computer-based image analysis. He is not an artist, but he's intrigued, like all of us on this call, he's intrigued by science and technology. And he decided that he would like to learn how to paint this. This is a Vermeer, by the way. He decided if artists in the 15th century could develop this technique, that Tim could reproduce their technique and he could produce a Vermeer. And here's what he learned about Vermeer, the painter. Vermeer there was no evidence in the historical record about Vermeer working with a master painter. There are no sketches. The early artists left the so-called cartoons as part of their bequest. And he knew this, that the paint has to go in the right place and it has to be the right color. And if you do that authentically, you will produce a piece of art. And here's Tim Jennison. He points out that there are no surviving sketches from many of the artists I've just shown you: Caravaggio, Vermeer, Hans Hals, Velasquez. So this is Tim in front of Buckingham Palace, decided to paint this Vermeer. It's called The Piano Lesson. And he had his teller who helped him do a documentary on his adventure of trying to create a Vermeer. You can rent the movie. It's called Tim's Vermeer. It's on Amazon Prime and probably many other sources online. And they went to London, to Buckingham Palace. They wanted to see this painting. It's owned by the Queen. It's in this building. It is not open to the public, but they finagled a way through the US Embassy. Tim was able to go look at the original, and you can see how big the original is. It's about 2 feet by 2 feet. He was not allowed to take a sketch pad. He was just allowed to stand there and look at it. Incidentally, this is a picture of Hawking working inside a camera obscura that he built. And you see, this is actually an upside down and backwards picture of a scene outside the camera obscura. They also went, Tim and his colleagues went to Holland and they visited the Moritz house, where this famous painting, A Girl with a Pearl Earring, is located. Here's Tim looking at that painting. This is also a Vermeer. It's the subject of a film starring Scarlett Johansson. I'll show you her as the girl in a second. Here's an example of Vermeer painting a scene at the waterfront. I mean, it looks to me like a photograph. So, what is Tim's process? He used camera lucida, which is a small circular mirror. This mirror right now, you are seeing a reflection of a photograph of Tim's grandfather as a high school student. The mirror is mounted on a post, and you can move the post around. And he looks at the photograph, and then he has this board behind. So if he's trying to match or draw the part of the face, which is this sort of shade, to me, it looks a little bit grayish green, whatever ink he uses or paint he uses must match this perfectly, because the right paint has to go in the right place and it has to have the right color. And when you get it right, the edge of the mirror disappears. This is what I mean by the disappearance. So Tim, who learned how to mix paints like Vermeer did by grinding up various ochres and so forth, he made up a paste of paint, painted it on this board, while he was looking at this part of his grandfather's face until this paint and the reflection of the photograph show no difference in color. And now you have the right color in the right place. There's where the mirror, the edge of the mirror would be if I essentially copied this. There's the elliptical shape of the edge of the mirror. And he continued, as practice, he continued to paint, and he produced, this looks a little rough. Here he is with actor and artist Martin Mull. Here's the original photograph of Granddad from high school. And I think you can see here, that's a great representation of this photograph. And this is how simple the camera lucida is. It has a weight or a suction cup, a bar, and a mirror right there that you can tilt. And you tilt the, now once you set this up to draw this, you cannot move this. Otherwise, the point of perspective changes. But you can rotate the mirror around the axis of this bar. And so Tim produced a very, if you watch the movie, you'll see he shows you this painting he did. It looks like a photograph. So this is Martin Mull again, looking at the camera lucida. It gives you, oh, here's the painting. This took 5 hours. This is part of the apparatus, but you can see this is a reflection of Granddad's face, and there's what Tim had painted. And so Tim wants to do this, the music lesson, which looks relatively simple. It has windows and so forth, and a double bass and a piano or a harpsichord. But it turns out that the original, which has been photographed, and you can see the photographs in detail, elaborate detail painted on these instruments. So he used the process that Vermeer probably used or learned how to use when he did this painting. This is considered to be the first attempt by Vermeer to use an optic to do a painting. Now, Tim was not first. Stedman, back in 18 years ago, had done work on using paintings of Vermeer and had figured out the size and shape of Vermeer's studio by looking at the perspective lines in the artwork he produced. So Tim had this as a resource and could have used this. This is once again a pinhole camera technique. There's some evidence that Vermeer used this method as well. But Tim wanted to be completely authentic here, so he learned how to make everything. Lenses, mirrors, and paint. He didn't buy anything. He produced it the way Vermeer would have done. Here he is getting instruction on how to mix paint. Here he is losing his mind trying to make lenses. So he has glass. There's the glass coming out of a kiln, and that's a mess. It's full of bubbles, but eventually you learn how to deal with that. Here he is grinding and polishing. And he had a lot of time and money, so he dealt with this, and he built a duplicate of Vermeer's studio. So let me make sure you understand. This is a cheap version of Vermeer's painting, full size. In the background, you're looking at a room that Tim built. Took 9 months to build this room with everything authentic to the original painting, using mannequins for the clothing, except when detail of human faces was required, he recruited his daughter, who's the age of the piano student, and a friend who looked somewhat like the piano teacher. He went looking for these kinds of ceramic pieces. He had to have them custom made because he couldn't find anything modern. But this room that he's sitting in, he was completely the creation of his own effort. It's in a warehouse somewhere in Southern California. So that's the studio. And this right here that I'm outlining is the painting he wanted to produce. Here he is consulting with Hockney, who was intrigued by this whole adventure. Now here's yet another piece of important evidence for those of you with an optical background. Here's a different Vermeer that it appears that Vermeer used optics to produce it. And look at this chromatic aberration at the back of this gown or this cloak. The only reason Vermeer would have copied that was it's what he saw. And the reason he saw it is the lens he used was not a perfect lens. It had what is called chromatic aberration. So the blues focus in one area and the white of the wall focuses in another area, and there's this fuzzy transition. A modern lens designed by a computer would have a sharp transition there. So in effect, without realizing it, Vermeer duplicated the chromatic aberration of the lens in the equipment he used, which suggests he did not use a camera obscura, because there is no lens in a camera obscura. Remember, that's a pinhole arrangement. So that's yet another clue that he was using optics. Here's the detail that really convinces me. Notice this kind of cream color in the wall, and it's different over here. If you don't look at this and then look over here, you can see there is a difference, but the human eye brain system cannot see that difference. I'm going to convince you of that in a second. So to get this transition, Vermeer must have used an optical technique that faithfully represented how the paint of the wall interacted with sunlight here differently than it did over here. So here's the proof that you cannot see the difference. Here's an optical illusion some of you may have seen of, obviously, chessboard with an optic here. And here are panels A and B. I've shown this many times, and of course everybody agrees A is darker than B, dramatically darker than B, but it's not. If you take this and put it here, and this and put it here, they are exactly the same shade of gray. The boxes are the same shade of gray. The human eye is influenced by a fantastic computer called Brain, and the brain takes care of this. It notices dark squares around a light square and lights around a dark. There's no way then that the artist could sense this difference by standing in the room using his own vision. So that's what this is to remind us of the difference between that and that. So Tim starts his process, painting the intricate detail on the pianoforte that the student is using. And after 7 days, has a technique. He modified his equipment to include a lens for magnification for this kind of stuff, something Vermeer could not have done. Here he is at 29 days, just working on this part. Let's go back and I'll remind you, he's painting the decoration right here on this part of the piano. Here's the teacher and the back of the student at 49 days. And all he's doing is looking at the camera lucida and matching the color of the scene and the color that he has produced when he created his paints. Here's Scarlett Johansson, by the way, in the movie, The Girl with a Pearl Earring. There's a passing reference to this scientific or this optical technique in the movie, but it's certainly not a focus of the movie. It's about Vermeer and his family life. So here is Tim at 83 days into the process. This is the fabric. This is 98 days. I don't know if you can see. That's like the tiniest paintbrush you can buy, like a 00 or something. So let's go back to the original painting, and I'll show you that it's this cloth draped over the table. And he had this produced. Remember, he's painting from the scene. Tim is not using this copy to do his version. He's looking at the duplication he has made of Vermeer's studio, including all the detail, like the fabric. Here at 130 days, he's beginning to see this is his painting at 130 days. And in the movie, if you rent the movie, you'll see him go to the premier art historian of this era of Dutch painting and tell this professor, I have done my version of a Vermeer. I want to see what you think. And the guy gasps when he sees it. It took Tim 130 days of tedious work, and he produced something that looks to an expert like a Vermeer. Now, the controversy is not over. So Hockney and Falco, his counterpart at the University of Texas, produced their book in 2001. A guy named Stork said, oh, you're all wrong. This is Stork's idea that the artists were good enough. They just had to look at the scene with a curved mirror, not use a camera lucida. So there was this confrontation in 2001. Stork, who's at Stanford, produced another analysis and another. Hockney updated his book to resolve issues that Stork had brought up. And I have other references here. Just 18 months ago, Falco did another rebuttal of Stork's approach and so forth. So the controversy is not over. But I think from what I've seen, most modern artists believe that optical techniques were definitely used by the late Renaissance artists. And there's some other references you can look at if you care. So that's the end of my talk. And I'm going to keep sharing in case people have questions. And we have to refer to the slides.
Yeah, this is John. On that Van Eyck wedding painting, according to Heck and Zajac, that was the earliest evidence of a curved mirror.
Yeah, John's talking about this convex mirror coming up. Hecht is a great guy and an expert. I think that probably is not right because glass makers, I'm sorry, I'm working back to that. But this is a convex mirror. I had not noticed that in Hecht's book. I have a hard time believing that because glass technology dates back, 5,000 years. People knew how to make a bowl.
Polished, curved and polished.
Oh, curved and polished. Yeah, well, okay, maybe. Yeah.
The other thing I'd like to comment on, Ed, is your 1470 paintings where the hand is long and the legs are long. What's really interesting, and I want to talk to Peter Scott about this with artificial intelligence, we can still identify them as humans. And a modern version of this is The Simpsons. You look at Bart Simpson, no kid looks like
Yeah.
that. His head's still big and it's got spikes on his head, you know, it's all wrong. But we look at that and we instantly identify that as a male child.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And Walt Disney was one of the early pioneers of this. His original drawings of Mickey Mouse depicted Mickey as a rat with a long pointy nose. And it took a while for him to realize that people did not like that drawing. It was off-putting, and so he changed it to look like a baby, where a baby is rotund, a round head, a round body. The head is almost as big as the body, little short stubby legs, huge eyes compared to the size of the head. And Mickey Mouse was born, and everybody said, "Oh, that's really cute." But a rat does not look cute because its body shape is wrong. But you're right. This looks like a human.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. This does not.
Easily can tell.
Yeah. Okay, good points.
Ed, you had asked somebody to remind you that there were current applications.
Oh, yes. Thank you. So here's a pinhole camera. And I mentioned that there are current applications where you cannot use a lens or mirror. And I'll give you an example. There are smokestack monitors that are used to detect the amount of airborne particulates in smoke coming out of a factory or something. And the way that they have targets that they can put in, movable targets, almost like eye charts, so they can look at the targets, or they look like barcodes, and see how much particulate is in the exhaust of a factory. But you can't do that with a lens because it will get covered with dirt and dust and damaged chemically, but you can do it with a pinhole camera. So what they do is they build a pinhole camera like this one, and they pressurize it so that they have a CCD here or some kind of detector. They pressurize this with dry nitrogen. The smokestack and the smoke is over here. So the nitrogen is going out through the hole so that no dust comes in and no dust clogs the hole, and they can see clearly into this exhaust plume. So that's an example where a pinhole camera is used in a modern application.
Thank you.
Oh, I have a question.
Yes?
In the Van Eyck, there is a chandelier, and from what I remember reading, the chandelier was one of the things, that he used this optical illusion on, but not for the whole thing. He started it, but he eyeballed a lot of it.
Right. Yes.
The combination that made him, great, what he did.
Well, see, there's something that could have happened as the artist used this technique. They may have begun to understand the issue in a new way. This part looks like he may have taken some license. And I'll remind you of something else. It took Tim 130 days to do his painting, and he says he worked on it every day. Yeah, an artist who is trying to make a living doing this would lose their mind in the details. So it is possible they took shortcuts wherever they could. For example, this brush, it wouldn't surprise me that Vermeer drew the handle and he said, I'm just going to fill that in. I'm not going to bother using optical techniques on.
And, Vermeer was not very prolific. There's only something like 20 or 25 Vermeer paintings on the planet.
That's right.
So he may have took a lot of time to do this stuff.
Yeah, you could do one a year or two a year. Once you learned this technique, that would be about your limit before you lost your mind. I mean, if you watch the movie, Tim's movie, you see him just having one setback after another, and somebody bumped the equipment and luckily he realized before he did any damage that the perspective point changed, and
Hmm.
there are all sorts of issues like that.
Let me also make a comment, if I may, on lensless, on where you use pinhole things. I think the gamma cameras, and when you do a PET scan, when you do gamma imaging in medicine, you can't focus positrons or gamma rays. So in effect, you gather them typically through multiple pinholes and reconstruct the image, so it's faster.
That is
But it's
true.
a pinhole technique.
Yep, that's true. And John and I have experience with something called a shearing interferometer, which or Shack-Hartman sensor, which works the same way to analyze optical systems to determine if they're what their defects are. So yes, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I've seen that too in some of this.
Have there been any investigations to see whether there were any other giveaways of left-right flipping? They were probably too smart to flip text, but I was looking at that illuminated manuscript.
Yes.
Next to the Pope,
Right.
and thinking, yeah, what did he do about that?
Well, there is, I have been looking for it because I've seen it. There is a picture of another Pope, not this Pope, and he's holding a globe, a very detailed globe in his left hand. And this was also pointed out as the Pope would have had the globe in his primary hand, indicating the reach of the Catholic Church over the entire earth. And now I agree with you, it's difficult to see if this is left to right reading or right to left, but this argument has been made that there's, compared to the general population, there are far more left-handed subjects in these paintings than you would expect.
So when something like a manuscript appears and they realize, well, I can't copy that the way it looks, then they've got to do something else.
Yes.
So if they
we have this example right here, where
So what did they do?
I don't know. We had the Caravaggio. That's a very interesting question.
I mean, yeah,
The
but
globe
I
is
mean, it's
correct.
sort of, because the globe is in an unusual position, so that when you look at the mirror image of it, it's going to look normal again, right? I mean, it's.
Well, here's a possibility, and that is looking at an image of a human, you would not necessarily notice that you've drawn a right-handed person as left-handed, but you cannot make that mistake if you're looking at writing. And the globe is covered with writing. So I'm wondering, that's a very good question. I didn't think of this. This globe, well, here's Africa.
But the continents haven't been flipped.
The continents have not been flipped. Is it possible that the artist realized, because there is language on the globe and on the music books, that they did the right thing lest their technique be exposed? But that's very interesting. Now, I'll bet you that that's an argument made by the people who think that Hockney and Falco are wrong. And right now I don't have time, but someday maybe I'll have time to go read the criticisms of Hockney to see if they bring that point up. But yes, this globe looks like a real globe.
Let me ask another question related to that, if I may.
Sure.
That I've got this inverted image that I'm looking at. I mean, it seems to me that it would be hard to paint that inverted image as you're seeing it, because we're so used to seeing things in their normal orientation. And I'm wondering whether there are any giveaways that when I look at it that would say this was painted as an inverted image.
Now, I just have a thought about this whole line of discussion. This painting almost certainly was done with camera lucida. And depending on how you lay it out, you don't get an inverted image. I'm going to jump ahead to the picture of Martin Mull. Some of you old people know him as a comedic actor. There's a way to do this so that the image you look at is not reversed. But you cannot do that with a pinhole camera. You can do it with this technique of this little mirror. And I believe the general consensus is that the ambassador painting was done, here's part of it. The ambassador painting was done with camera lucida, not a camera obscura. And I think that addresses your comment that it would be difficult to paint it when it's upside down. Well, you wouldn't be doing that. You would be matching color and color position by looking at the scene and then looking at what you're doing and mixing the right color, your pigments, and you would not have that problem.
So, Ed, I have a question there. Wouldn't it be easier to take the camera lucida technique to just get the outline and the segments, because that is symmetrical, because it's a globe, and then basically just paint, you have the object, right? I mean, that's what they were looking at, a physical object, so the people and all these props, and then this doesn't look very complicated, so you could copy it.
You could, except for this. I'm highlighting here, this end of the lute, this color, this wood, and the wood used throughout the lute is probably the same or similar wood, but you have this different shading back here. So if you did a cartoon of the scene and just drew the outlines, it would be very difficult, as I showed you in that optical illusion, to get this shade of blonde to this shaded area to get that right. Because you have to, you would hold the object in a lighting condition, not the same as you have in the painting itself, which is this. So that, yeah, I agree. You could just do the outline, but look at this detail. And there's a limit to how much the models can put up with too.
Or look at the lighting on the globe that clearly shows a rather complex shading.
Right.
There was a question from Ann Seal. Did you see it in the chat box?
Oh, no, I'm looking at my slides. So I'm
So she asked about whether or not you could insert a 45-degree mirror to do some de-inversions.
Yeah, oh yeah. Actually, let's go back to the very beginning and I'll show you there's actually a picture here. If you use a prism, which is a little more sophisticated and harder to find at that time, rather than a mirror, you can get this experience where this artist is looking straight down, but they're using what's called a poro prism. So the light goes in, reflects in the prism and gets it re-inverted so that you see it as if you were looking directly at the object.
Yeah.
See, but even this little child's version is flipped.
Right.
So, go ahead.
Yeah. So is there any thought that the artists ever combined the mirror with the pinhole to re-invert the image?
They could have. I didn't see a lot of that in the literature. What the literature emphasizes is to have this method, except you put a lens here because you have the same experience. The artist has the same experience, but it's much brighter if you have a lens rather than just a hole.
When you look at the history of cameras, it's that same process, figuring out how to look through the camera and see something in the right direction and not turned upside down. I have a camera that is 65 years old, it's sitting in my cabinets, which is basically a pinhole camera kind of thing. It's a small black box. Of course, it took film. I was given it as a birthday present when I was very young. And now I have cameras that have mirrors and lenses inside, so everything is correct when you're looking through it.
Right.
It's changed, and they did not necessarily have that technology. That took time to understand.
Right, and so what we're seeing here, for example, is a pinhole camera with a ground glass and a partially transparent mirror called a pellicle, and the photographer would look down at this scene and see that they were pointing in the right direction and pull out a slide that protected the film. And you pull the slide out, and depending on your skill, you'd put the slide back in at the right time so you didn't overexpose, and you would get this scene, because this one is not inverted.
I'm not an artist, but I had a couple girlfriends that were. I don't think upside down's a big deal at all. Think of what a sculptor does. They make a negative mold of something and a total negative mold, and then dump the copper in. I mean, humans can do this.
Yeah, a limited number can. Everything I've said tonight does not explain the sculptures done by the Michelangelo and Rodin and bronze castings and so forth, which are very authentic looking, and they're really in 3D. It's a 3D representation of a 3D object. No, all of this is an effort to represent 3D on a 2D surface. And
I was struck in taking history of art. They showed Giotto, one of the first people who tried a perspective, and it wasn't very good. So there are all sorts of clues like checkerboard floors and rooms that have lots of predominant beams and stuff like this to try to convince you that you're looking at a 3D thing.
Right, except then we have these very, very old Egyptian paintings. Yeah. So the art form was lost, at least the painting was lost, in the interval that included the Greek and Roman empires, and until the 1500s.
I actually have some experience in this. We did some 3D infrared, and one interesting papers I've come across, in fact, there's several. The old story, somebody goes to Hollywood, and they're in Beverly Hills, and they meet Tom Cruise or Cameron Diaz. They say, they're not as good looking as I thought, and it's because they look better in 2 dimensions than 3 dimensions.
Yeah, this is what the Hollywood people say, that they resonate with the camera. So there's a term they use.
Photogenic. The photogenic people tend to look better in 2D than 3D.
Yeah, I can see that.
We've had 3D movies for the last 10 plus years, and I haven't seen their fan base decrease.
Well, I think it's changing. I think 3D movies will change it, but we've had very few 3D movies.
If you look at a lot of actresses, they are incredibly skinny, but they look pretty normal on the screen.
Well, this is an ancient. The fact that humans visualize differently in 2 and 3 dimensions is well known. For example, if you go to Florence, Italy, and see the famous statue of David, seen from above, an authentic copy of David done with like a laser profiling looks weird, because the whole shape of the hands, everything was modified from reality, because the audience is viewing the sculpture from below, and that changes everything. The same thing in Nashville, Tennessee has a Parthenon, a copy of the Parthenon. The pillars, if you step away from the building 100 meters or something, the pillars looks like they're vertical, but they aren't. They're curved. And this is a technique the ancient Greeks used so that when you viewed the building, the curvature that your vision system imposes is removed, and everything looks straight, when in fact it's not. It's,
Disney and other theme parks do this with like their buildings. The higher stories on Main Street are smaller to make them look taller, and they really did something with the Hogwarts at Universal Studios to make it look enormous compared to what it really is. I stared at that thing for a long time trying to see how they did that. And I couldn't. It still looked much bigger than it could have been.
and making it smaller at the top is also a good thing from the point of view of the structural stability. Like I was recently at the Burj Khalifa in the Middle East, and it's huge, but the weight of the building prevents, I mean, it couldn't have been a right rectangular solid. It just would weigh too much. So it goes to a point. Look, the very top of it's tiny, and it looks like it's far away. It looks like it's 3 miles away.
I have a question about the left-right business. My observation is that most people's faces are not symmetrical. And so when you switch it left to right, it looks like a different person.
Absolutely.
So, but I wonder if in painting, in general, artists don't do that. They make it much more symmetrical.
I don't know.
Look at these images. They all look pretty symmetrical. But the way to know is then you have to take a mirror image and look at the two of them.
Well, you have to have the model look straight at you.
Yeah.
And yes, you're absolutely right. If you take a picture of yourself, have somebody do it where you're looking straight at, then they cut the picture in half and put two right,
yes,
produce your face with two right halves, you look different. You will be recognized, but you look different than if you use two lefts or a right and a left.
Yeah.
Absolutely not symmetrical.
I thought I might do a, I think maybe we should probably stop now.
Sure.
I'd like to do a little housekeeping just in general for people who don't know. If you mute yourself and you want to speak, you can just press the space bar, and during the time you have the space bar down, we'll hear you. When you take your hand off of it, you'll be muted again. It's a lot easier than going in with your cursor and trying to unmute yourself and whatnot. So if you don't know that, it's something you ought to know. We're going to keep doing this. Also, want to point out that, again, that Peter Scott's class begins, I believe, on the 8th. I know at least 3 of us have signed up for it at University of Victoria. It's $100, and it's a course on AI. I believe it's 2 hours per, or is it 1 hour? No, 2 hours per class. Is that right, Peter?
That's right, yeah. And I think they want sign-ups by like the 5th because they need to set up the accounts. And but it is on Wednesdays, so it's gonna, the first one's on the 9th.
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, right?
Yeah, I already got my confirmation on they're having a Zoom exercise before the first lecture, just to make sure that the equipment all works.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're getting some more people signing up. We have 3 more. We have 2 more scheduled, and maybe we can twist Ed's arm again, and maybe Mr. Hastings, and we can keep this going and get through this pandemic and be smarter for it. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight for Science for the Board, and we'll see you next week, same time, same station. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
That was really good. Thank you.
That was excellent.
I did not know this stuff is fascinating.
Thank you, Ed.
Okay, you're welcome.
You're amazing.
And I'm going to ask some AI people about that
I
question,
don't know
John.
what is it you don't know anything about? It's pretty amazing. Okay, thank you.